Thank you. Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. Just to kind of pick up some of the funding issues that Wendy touched on, just before we come to that, already had some discussion about UK government, Scottish government's understanding of the role of the IROs. Just want to ask, does UKRI have a good understanding of the Scottish research landscape and the actual role devolution plays in that? Just start with yourself, Professor Roberts.
I mentioned earlier that I think UKRI funding is very important because it funds fundamental research, which is really important to the Institute, and it also has these cross-council calls. And the cross-council calls also tend to be on themes which are very aligned with our interests. So a recent one has been the Land Use for Net Zero call that UKRI have put out, and that focuses on soil health, on agricultural systems, on land use change, and these are issues which are very, very well aligned with the needs of research in Scotland. So in some sense, yes, in terms of the funding areas and the nature of funding that's provided, I guess the issue goes back to, again...
Does that come as a coincidence or an opportunity rather than a full understanding? I mean, their understanding of, you know, the Scottish research landscape?
It's a good question. I think what I would say is quite a lot of our colleagues are on UKRI panels. We help shape the bids. So there's a degree of collaboration. The Land Use for Net Zero, I know, was very focused on the devolved administrations, and it was explicit about recognising that. So, and I would say that UKRI are very good at visiting the Institute. We have a good relationship with them. So it's not that there's a bad relationship there, but it just goes back to the funding issue again, I guess. I think sometimes they don't understand the extent to which institutes like ourselves can't get capital from other sources, and where therefore things like the Tay Cities regional deal was really important to us. UKRI have some schemes which exclude the institute, the independent research organisations, from bidding for it, like the I'll have to get the name right, UK Research Partnership Investment Fund is only open to universities. It's not open to IROs. So it might be they don't quite understand the extent to which we're not eligible for certain types of funding, and as a result, you could argue there's a misunderstanding there of the landscape.
Yeah, and I mean, just on that, so you said they're very good at engaging in terms of visits. So how come if they're very good at visiting and meeting with you and having dialogue, there's still that disconnect that they don't understand your funding requirements and, you know, the obstacles that are effectively put in your way?
Well, I'll start and then I think it is just a very complicated landscape. They have their own institutes, which they do have a different funding relationship with. It's just that some of us too, are kind of like don't have parent research councils, which is where it becomes a little bit complicated. So it's just how diverse the landscape is, and that's where that mapping exercise would be really useful, to just clarify exactly where everyone stands and who's eligible for what and so forth.
Professor Nisbet, you want to add to anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very clear explanation. I do think that UKRI are very good at engaging with us to understand what an IRO is. You know, we certainly have had visits from the Animal Health and Welfare Funders Forum, who have very high-level people from the scientific strategy side of things in UKRI who come to visit us to discuss what their scientific strategy is for funding in terms of funding areas and cross-council calls. However, those aren't the same people who are setting the budgets and saying, you know, okay, there is this funding shortfall, what do we do about it? So I think perhaps there's a disconnect there, that you know, the people who are speaking to us about scientific strategy aren't necessarily the right people to be speaking to about the financial and fiscal strategy.
Yes, I think for us we have an interesting little twist in that for a period of time, I mentioned that we go back to the 1880s, but for a period from perhaps about the 60s through to the 80s or so, we actually were formally effectively fully funded by what is now the Natural Environment Research Council, so one of the UKRI councils. So for a period of time, we were a research council institute, and then have now reverted back. So our relationship with, if you like, a host research council is generally pretty good. What has now happened, however, is that we've evolved, and so where if there is any lack of clarity, is the research councils and others don't really realise how we might have evolved and what the complicated landscape now looks like. But I would say that I would certainly say that that's not a function of devolution in any way. It's just it's if you like, a child has gone off and evolved in a different way. So generally we've got a pretty good relationship and understanding, I would say, but I think understanding could always be improved.
Thanks. And some of the background notes I picked up that there's actually a UK Government Commission independent review into UKRI funding last year, and they noticed that they commented the 80%, 20% policy disadvantaged IROs. Previously in 2021, Sir John Kingman, the outgoing UKRI chair, also noted the difficulty with the bridging gap for IROs. So it seems to be a known issue, and clearly you've each highlighted 80-20 as an issue going forward for stability and weight. So is there any understanding why there seems to be there's been no movement yet by UKRI, in terms of opening up 100% funding?
I don't know why that should be, to be honest.
No, this is an issue that's been going on for years, actually. So it isn't a recent thing at all, and it applies equally to us as well. It's if we were purely funded by, we'd be bankrupt if we were purely funded by UKRI grants. We could not survive at all on UKRI grants. It's not a new feature. Why it still exists, I don't know. I remember a very erudite piece given by a former minister, David Willett, actually has written extensively on this 80-20 funding and how it's stifling research. And to be honest, it's as relevant for the universities as it is for us.
Yeah. And if it's stifling research, UKRI are clearly not getting their desired outcomes in some areas as well, presumably.
Well, indeed.
Can I just quickly, to finish off, just ask each of you in turn, if you're able to quantify just what that 80-20 does mean in the long run in terms of, potential limiting capacity to make bids because you can't get the fund up to open, or if, you can't get that access to 20% to make it a viable bid, and or what it does mean for financial long-term stability.
Yes, I'm not going to be able to quantify it, but I can give a narrative to it. It would mean that we wouldn't go for certain types of projects which in the longer run might undermine our translational pipeline, which is where we do different types of research all the way along the research pipeline, from very fundamental right through to industry related, policy related. So UKRI plays a very important role within that pipeline, and if we were to stop doing that, I think it would threaten our whole sort of approach to doing research. It would mean perhaps that you weren't getting the best people doing particular grants. If you're not getting everybody competing, you're not necessarily getting the best people doing research projects. And I guess the main thing is it would also send a signal. UKRI is a very well-respected funding source, and if we stop doing that, it might threaten the way that we're recognised more broadly within the research infrastructure.
Potential reputational issues, not accessing that field.
Yes.
Yeah. Professor Nisbet, anything to add?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think UKRI grants are an extremely good way for particularly early career researchers to come into institutes like us, for us to have the external funding to do work that perhaps we wouldn't have done, but we have very good scientists who are able to write competitive grants to bring in new blood into the institute, to allow early career researchers to establish their careers in the IROs, and I think that's really the lifeblood our type of institutes would be very reluctant to start to ask people not to write those grants on the basis of a financial decision, but it does affect the balance of what we are able to ask people to go for in terms of funding. You know, UKRI is 80-20. Some of the other funding councils are even worse than that, and so we have actively asked people not to submit particular grants to particular funders in a certain year because we couldn't afford to make up the full economic costing. Yeah.
Yes, and that's a very similar situation to what I say. I mean, it's the most tragic thing to do, particularly to an early career scientist, is to say, actually, you know what, we can't afford for you to do that, because the UKRI and similar types of funding, I mean, it's the gold standard for the research, and so if you really want to create new assets and new knowledge, that's really where it's done. And so what we do, and you know, it creates behaviours and the type of organisation that you create in order to enable the institute to go for the UKRI money, because it is where you can get the blue skies research done. And so you do all sorts of things that you might not perhaps prefer to do in order to support the, as I say, the gold standard blue skies research, without which we would have nothing really.